If I were to ask you, what can we do to stop climate change, what would you say? Stop using plastic straws? Take shorter showers? Turn the lights off when you leave the room or carpool to work? Well, every positive environmental action, no matter how small, does make a difference. These small-scale actions alone are not enough to solve our climate crisis. Switching to LED bulbs as our only attempt to solve climate change is the equivalent of throwing a cup of water on a forest fire. It's a nice gesture, but we are going to need a lot more help than that to put it out. To avoid our global temperature from increasing 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we have to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 and become net zero by 2050. This requires immediate and drastic global efforts from those with the most money and power. But first, let's explore who is contributing the most to global greenhouse gas emissions. In 2019, industry remained the largest culprit, generating 30% of global emissions. Electric power generation contributed to 26% of global emissions, the vast majority of which came from combustion of coal. Land use, agriculture, and waste made up 21%, followed by transportation and buildings at 16 and 7%. The Climate Accountability Institute found that since 1965, the 20 largest investor and state-owned fossil fuel companies produce 35% of carbon emissions worldwide. They also found that the 108 fossil fuel and cement entities in their database emitted 69.6% of the global carbon total since 1751. And these corporations were aware of the catastrophic impact of fossil fuels on our Earth's climate as early as the mid-1960s. Corporations like ExxonMobil and BP are currently funneling billions of dollars into discrediting climate change science and suppressing climate policies in government. From 1986 to 2015, the 5 major oil companies in the US spent an average of $120 million per year in promotional spending. And corporate emission reduction goals are often empty promises made to placate the public.
Mr. McCoy will become one of the first ever executives to claim that ExxonMobil has aggressively fought climate science using front organizations to maximize shareholder profit.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true.
Mainstream media uses a communications framework that shifts the blame for the climate crisis on the actions of humans as a species, incorrectly grouping corporate and non-corporate sources of greenhouse gas emissions together. When compared to corporations, individual consumers, especially those in poverty, hold far less financial and political power to avert climate change. The first communication theory I want to discuss is called framing, which is an extension of the agenda-setting theory. Framing occurs when the media presents an event or an issue to the public within a particular field of meaning. The public then interprets this information through presented or preconceived worldviews called frames. Frames are incredibly powerful at influencing public perception and decision-making. Not only was framing found to restrict information used to judge events, it also causes audiences to deflect responsibility for solving political and social problems away from politicians. If the media uses episodic framing, where issues are viewed through individual events, instead of thematic framing, which seeks to find a greater theme, audiences fail to understand the connections between social issues and political action. Or in this case, the thematic connections between climate change, corporate greed, and political corruption. Rather than holding corporations and politicians accountable, the public believes individual consumers should be blamed for their role in climate change. But shame, when directed at the right entities, can be a powerful motivator. The theory of naming and shaming as a form of climate action incentivizes voluntary commitments, and penalizes non-compliance among corporations and states. Simply, if an external auditing system finds that a corporation or state is not complying with climate-conscious practices, they are named and publicly shamed with the hope that it puts enough pressure on the entity to change their behavior. This could overcome the downfalls of legal and financial climate commitments, which often fail due to many states being financially dependent on corporations who can be worth more than entire countries. Naming and shaming is the most effective when used against corporations that have a direct business-to-consumer relationship. In this case, reputation is crucial to their company's success because they have a recognizable product that consumers can choose not to buy. So for my senior research project, I decided to explore how Netflix climate change documentaries frame corporate responsibility for our climate crisis. I chose Netflix because it is one of the most popular streaming platforms in the world, operating in 190 countries with an estimated 214 million global paid memberships. Their global reach has incredible power to shape how the public perceives climate change responsibility. I collected data on 8 full-length Netflix documentaries that discuss climate change or climate change-related issues. When a corporation or a corporate-owned product was featured audibly or visually during a documentary, I recorded each feature's duration, corporate information, and context. I chose to record data on state-owned corporate enterprises and profit-driven corporations and industries whose business practices have a direct effect on greenhouse gas emissions like manufacturing, agriculture, and trade. So no nonprofits, corporate-owned news channels, social media, or entertainment. Corporate features and corporate product features were categorized into positive, negative, and neutral contexts. If a feature portrayed the corporation or corporate product as harming the environment, it was classified as negative. If the feature portrayed the corporation or corporate product as helping the environment or having environmentally friendly practices, it was considered positive. If a corporation or corporate product was featured during the documentary but did not have any relevance to the environmental issues being discussed, it was considered neutral. On average, these documentaries spent around 5% of the total time discussing corporations and less than 1% of the total time discussing corporate products. Brave Blue World spent 30% of its total time discussing corporations, the most out of the 8 documentaries, but all features were framed in a positive context. Kiss the Ground was the only documentary that spoke about corporations critically, delegating around 2% of the total time to negative corporate features. Kiss the Ground and Cowspiracy were the only documentaries that included negative corporate product features as well. Rather than discussing corporate responsibility, these documentaries were far more likely to criticize environmental nonprofits and media sources failing to accurately portray the climate crisis, or governments at large for failing to enact climate policy. I want to make it clear I am not discrediting these documentaries simply because they did not thoroughly discuss corporate climate change responsibility. Any documentary that is taking the time to shed light on the complexities of our climate crisis is a valuable resource in this fight. But let's discuss the nuance in my results and why these documentaries may not have chosen to discuss corporations or corporate products. One of the reasons could be the financial or legal repercussions that can occur if a documentary talks negatively about a corporate entity, like copyright and defamation lawsuits or removal of funding. Some climate change documentaries like Mission Blue, Bill Nye Science Guy, and A Life on Our Planet had narratives which chose to focus on the lives of leading environmental scientists like Bill Nye, David Attenborough, and Sylvia Earle. The documentary may also be partially sponsored by the corporations it positively features, like L'Oreal in Brave Blue World. Because of the time restraints, I chose to focus on only full-length documentaries, but there are still other Netflix series with episodes that discuss climate change and corporate responsibility, like Dirty Money, Inside Bill's Brain, Explained, and Down to Earth with Zac Efron. With that being said, I do believe that by not including substantial information about corporate greenhouse gas emissions in climate change documentaries, a crucial framework is being withheld from the public. Corporations are guilty of consciously polluting our water supply and our fresh air, destroying fragile ecosystems and emitting billions of tons of greenhouse gases for the sake of their profit margins. They need to be held accountable if we are going to have any chance at averting the climate crisis. So what can you do as a consumer with limited time, money, and resources? Become politically active. Vote for politicians that will enact climate change policies and hold corporations accountable. Join a local environmental organization and protest against environmentally harmful corporations and policies. Educate yourself about climate change and the corporations you rely on so you can seek out sustainable alternatives. If you can't afford these alternatives, work to minimize your carbon footprint to the best of your social and financial ability. Get involved in your community. People living in poverty are the most vulnerable to the devastating impacts of climate change, like drought, resource depletion, and desertification. By advocating for your community's right to quality education, healthcare, housing, and safety, you are helping others in alleviating the climate crisis. In the end, climate change is not just an environmental crisis, it is a human crisis. Even in the worst possible environmental outcome, the Earth as a planet will eventually adapt to survive the scorching heat, extreme weather events, and polluted air. But humans will not.